Point.
We're living in a modern age of the new psychedelic renaissance.
And I thought, this is not real. This is, my gosh, I'm on the radio. People hear me.
How we give to others and affect others' lives, and what we do with it is important.
Don't focus on the rest of the world, just focus on your own life.
And facts can't deal with emotions. It's like apples and oranges.
Bronze Age and Iron Age, I think all could all be called the Wood Age.
You're not picking a president, you're actually picking a roommate.
Because you don't know what their story is. You don't know what pain they're dealing with.
Always part of me wanted an audience.
It's naive to think that human beings have stopped evolving.
The people are purple.
The world is a very rich place if you start exploring.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the podcast Point Counterpoint. I'm your host, Chris Wright. And today I brought on the guest, Noah Healy. And I'll let you take it away from here.
Thanks, Chris. Sure. Noah Healy, I'm a recreational mathematician, and I'm working on promulgating a brand new marketplace mechanism to upgrade how economics functions.
All right. And you say recreational mathematician. Would you mind explaining that a little bit here?
We do it for fun, basically. Math is basically my vocation and my avocation. When I'm professionally employed, it's as a programmer, and my specialty is algorithmic development, but I'm very fascinated by the process of computation and working out whether or not things are possible, whether or not things that are impossible are approximable, and for the things that can be done, how they can be done effectively or efficiently.
All right. And so what is it that really, drives you here? What is your main, what is the thing that really pushes you towards this passion?
Initially, just the sheer beauty of the mathematics, the ability in general computation to design a relatively simple machine that is capable of taking on the characteristics of any system that you can describe is quite literally magical. Effectively, you can turn your imagination into reality if you can imagine well enough to actually describe how that system works. In the specific case of the market mechanism, I'm looking at a situation where the systems that we're presently using are being overwhelmed by the capacities that we have. And so I'm looking at a future where the economy is going to basically keep getting less and less stable. And I have a way to not merely stabilize it, but also make it significantly better functioning. Because there's lower overhead expense using my approach than the traditional one.
And would you mind explaining what this approach is? What is your approach to improving this marketplace?
I call them coordinated discovery markets, or CDM. And essentially the core insight is recognizing that a deal actually has three components. And so the traditional two-sidedness of deals, where you bring a buyer and a seller together and they come to an agreement, should actually be a three-sided product, purchasing capital, information thing. And so I've designed a way to have three separate marketplaces for people, producers, to bring product to market at deals that are publicly negotiated on behalf of everyone that wants to buy and sell, to people who are bringing cash to market to take deliveries for those products, and essentially living off of the commission on the deal flow of that system. So that essentially linearizes the existing system. Has a aspect of predator-prey that causes a certain amount of turbulence and chaos inevitably, And what this does is effectively creates an opportunity to remove that from the system profitably for the players. And by removing that from the system, you get something that is smoother.
Okay, interesting. Would you mind providing an example of this, just to give some concrete something?
Yeah, sure. So if we take, say, agricultural commoditized product today, if a corn farmer, for example, is going to have a pretty decent idea of how much his fields are likely to yield. Disaster might cause that to shift, but then he'd have disaster insurance to cover those sorts of things. So barring some very unforeseen circumstance, he's got a pretty decent idea of how much he's got to sell. What he doesn't necessarily have a pretty decent idea of is how much he's going to get to sell it for. And these farms generally are operating in a credit scenario where they need ongoing cash flow, which means that he has to have a relationship with his bank for his line of credit to make things work, which means that the banker needs to know how much he's actually going to make. So he goes to a marketplace and buys futures contracts, essentially pre-agreeing how much he'll sell his crop for. And on average, he sells those futures contracts for less than they're going to wind up getting settled for when the time comes to actually make delivery. But he's assured, he knows what these prices are, because he's an individualized deal giving him that information. At the same time, say a ranch owner that was going to buy that corn as feed for his cattle, is in more or less the same boat. He knows roughly how much feed he's going to need. He does not necessarily know how much it's going to cost. And once again, he has a relationship with his bank that needs to be assured that it knows where things are going. So he too will buy a futures contract, and on average, basically 49 out of 50 times, those two futures contracts won't be with each other. They'll be with some middlemen, probably not the same middlemen. So once again, he'll pay more on average than the final settlement price, but at least he knows what the number is going to turn out to be because he has a private individual system to tell him that. And so the spread between these two can become quite large. While getting the deal is relatively inexpensive, getting a good deal is very expensive. So what my system does is essentially sets up large pooled trading opportunities. So you're not taking the risk of being out there by yourself. You're getting a group rate, basically, of everyone that's going to be buying or selling. And each of these pool opportunities has a price being independently forecast and negotiated. So that future deal that they each had to make a private and not particularly great stab at instead becomes something that is publicly negotiated and debated up until the time that it's actually needs to be acted upon, at which point they would each enter that pool to operate at the price that was publicly known, which means that each of them can show their bank essentially the market price, which they will be able to have access to. And that market price, once it stabilizes, which it stabilizes at roughly the same forward period that current futures have to be bought at, because once again, everyone has a pretty generally good idea of how things actually are going to be 3 or 6, or in more industrial materials, 3 to 6 months for agriculture, for industrial materials, like 2 to 5 years out, because of the ground doesn't change as much. You can show that to your bank that this is the price that everyone who's going to be trading then has sort of already stably agreed to, because that's what happened.
So essentially, the plan is increased transparency in what these prices are, so that middlemen can't start inflating the prices, so to increase prices for both the so that everyone ends up paying more in the end.
Right. Well, there's a few pieces in this. Number one, the existing system is technically completely transparent. What this is doing is actually shrinking the amount of information that's being transparently uh, uh, promulgated. So the existing system has petabytes of information flying around, much of which is highly transitory and nonsensical. But it's all transparent. If you own several, fiber connections and want to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for the subscriptions, you can see what's going on in real time. And the middlemen do this professionally, so they do that. What this does is it drops the noise production of the marketplace precipitously. And so it makes it so that ordinary users with what are generally ordinary internet connections can actually have full awareness of what's going on in their marketplaces, the same as current intense players. The other point is the middlemen aren't so much jacking prices up as they're jacking prices wide. So their goal is to separate the two more and more. One stat that I saw recently, American beef markets 60 years ago, 60 cents of the dollar spent to buy beef wound up with the ranchers. Today, it's a little under 40 cents. So there's been basically a 20 point drop. There are other markets where similar things happened. I'm not sure whether or not this has been run dry finally, but for roughly a decade, a company worked out a way to use Detroit warehouses to create a 1-year backlog in the global aluminum market, which they would repair for people who had bought that aluminum for a 20-point surcharge. And so for at least a decade, if you bought aluminum foil, 20 cents of the dollar you spent on that aluminum foil was going to the people that had come up with this scheme, basically.
Yeah, the problem that I'm seeing here is something that I've noticed in the past, actually, which is it's basically that the distance between the producer and the consumer has been increasingly widening, essentially, and so there's more and more middlemen, and then the more middlemen you add, the more the price is going to go up. And so basically, the only way that you're going to have like a decent price for the consumer is, basically the person on the producing end is going to end up starting making less and less, just so the other one can have a decent price. So I suppose really the only solutions would be to try to, simplify, go back to when there is less distance between these two ends, or a system like yourself with the pooling.
Yes, and unfortunately, simplifying the existing market is a difficult task. There have been various proposed regulations to try to get that kind of thing to happen. But
go back to a more local type system.
Right. But one, there's no sort of prima facie way to tell the difference between new useful information and noise. So regulatory schemes that try to get the manipulators out usually don't do a particularly good job of getting rid of the manipulators, but do an excellent job of getting rid of the useful players. And so you sort of get the worst of both worlds. Localization and simplification has a limited set of legs because we have large and complex economies that have many, many input and output requirements. And so if you go local, you're basically stuck with whatever the resources that your local region can actually handle. And that will take out computer technology for literally everybody, because either you live in Taiwan and you have a local source of computer chips, but you don't have a local source of energy, or you don't live in Taiwan, in which case you don't have a local source of computer chips, and you may also not have a local source of energy.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I see your point right there. It makes a lot of sense. What's one potential critique of your system, and how would you respond to that?
Well, the primary objection I get is different things to the tune of, why doesn't this already exist? You know, what why go first? And I beyond having to be thought up in the first place, I don't have much more to recommend it. One of the difficulties with having thought of this much earlier than when I actually thought of it is that it depends on broadcast protocols that allow for people to be assured that they're seeing uniform information. So operating this kind of scenario where negotiations are being conducted in public require the negotiators to be assured that the thing that they're looking at is the same thing that everybody else is looking at, and the thing that they're contributing towards is the same thing everybody else is contributing towards. In past ages, when communication was happening by horseback, or possibly just by early wire transfer, it was relatively easy to fake things. The yellow journalism period in America, where Hearst, famously told his photographer to supply the pictures and he would supply the war. The ability to shade broadcast information has been a major issue for the last couple centuries. But with things like distribution of software products online, as well as the credit system, we've developed the cryptographic protocols required to be able to send information to large numbers of people in ways that they can be assured that the information they're looking at is the same information that everybody else is looking at. And that's a hard problem to solve that I don't have to, because somebody else did that back in the 70s.
What would you say are some of the main problems that this solves? Or I should say, what are some of the main societal economic problems?
Okay.
That it solves?
I think the first and most important thing it helps with is shifting our economic priorities towards things that actually benefit us as a society. Right now, we have a strong push towards service and control jobs for the sort of best and brightest among us. If you're sharper than the average bear and you want to make a lot of money, you go to a city and start working in the financial sector, and that's, maybe you get washed out, but if it works, then it works and you make a bunch of money. The issue with services as the primary driver of the economy is that services, in order to be valuable, have to make things better for their users by more than those services cost. And it's very easy for services to fall into a sort of competitive crab bucket scenario, where if, say, the two of us are in the same service provision business, it's helpful. I can offer people help by stopping you from harassing them, and you can offer people help by stopping me harassing them, and you get a situation where society is actually worse off for both of our services, even though the individuals we're helping are better off for having them. And we need production. We all eat, we all need clothing, we all wear shoes and live in houses and stuff. So by shifting the bulk of the returns back into the pockets of producers, we create a situation where entrepreneurs intelligent people who maybe lack ambition, whatever, who want a reasonable life for themselves go into the business of producing more, and that is where general social benefit actually comes from.
That's very true. In would you mind explaining that? Like, what sorts of benefits could we get from this when we have some of our brightest minds going more into the production side of things?
Well, it's sort of not very well known, but we're in an absolute renaissance of agricultural productivity, and we may well be able to reach some sort of real turning point in our ability to do mineral extraction as well, if reasonable capital and inventiveness can be put towards those things. So in the last generation or so, productivity per acre on Earth has gone up by, depending on the specific thing, between a factor of 2 and 10. A lot of that comes down to the fact that we can now move phosphorus, nitrogen, and other fertilizer material from where it is to places that have the correct kind of weather to grow whatever it is we feel like eating. There's a lot of other possibilities inherent in mechanization at these levels. So we're seeing more and more specialized and more capable farm equipment, allowing a very small fraction of us to be employed in producing the agricultural chain. If the returns on farming goes up tremendously, then the possibility to reinvest and also take the time to think about entirely new ways of doing things becomes much more reasonable. And with the sort of resource chains that we now have, there's sort of every reason to believe that, from robotic weeders to AI systems that can do land management, and other kinds of technical breakthroughs that could exist in that system, that we could see pretty significant improvements productivity wise in these sectors if it was worth it to people to do that. And in a world where that happens, we see the necessities of life becoming more common and higher quality in order to keep being sold. So people eating better food, having better health, and living lives that are more productive.
Excellent. What is your view for the future with this program, or actually with and without this program?
So I'm pretty much just covered with the program. I think that we could see a significant cut in the overhead cost of operating our economies, and see those economies flourish in the productive sector with a lot of inventiveness being applied in ways that I frankly can't even imagine. Without it, it looks kind of bleak to me. I'm looking at a financial system that is persistently failing in its most basic tasks, and doing so with increasing frequency. And while the specific instances, like the recent bank failures in my country, have explanations that certainly are blameworthy for the people who are executing them. The people operating these banks were doing so in very ridiculous fashions. What I'm looking at is an environment where the foundation of these systems, the markets that we currently use, are based on this notion of sort of informed players being able to make profit by getting less informed players to make deals that aren't as good. And what informed means is essentially tautological. Informed means getting deals that make money. So informed can mean manipulating the marketplace, or taking advantage of psychological shifts, or taking advantage of technological issues. And in a world where the communication volume is cranking up to the point where humans actually can't cope with it at all, and it's all machines, the scope of strategic advantage that's available within that system wanders arbitrarily far away from producing economies that are functioning. So it's kind of well known that command control economies don't work because the bureaucrat that's in charge doesn't really know what the price is supposed to be. So whatever they pick turns out to be wrong. If your marketplace is essentially fantasizing with itself about what reality might be because people have been able to put together enough of a social media campaign and enough robots to do things to make it look like something else is going wrong, so that it too is persistently producing incorrect prices, then it doesn't magically start working. It's the prices being wrong that causes these systems to fail.
All right, very good. And you said at one point that you combine physics and mathematics together. How would this play into all this?
Well, I'm building off of that combination. One of the big math papers of the 20th century was on information theory, and this idea of how to measure information and how to efficiently move information across a channel. And what that did was establish, given some sequence of symbols, how much information is in that sequence. And as essentially a joke at the time, it was decided to name this quantity entropy. It turns out that experimentally, we've determined that for the majority of physical systems, there's some very, very bizarrely designed quantum systems where these two things aren't identical. But in all other physical systems, the information theoretic entropy, which is a mathematical quality of symbols, and the physical measurement of entropy, which is a thermodynamic property of systems, are exactly the same value and evolve in exactly the same ways because they are the same value. It's the same driving force in each case. And so once you realize this identity for most practical purposes, you can sort of create a thermometer for information, if you will, and start treating information systems the way that you would treat industrial or thermodynamic systems. And so that's where the concept of splitting out the information from the deal into a separate space, where the noise and signal in the deal space is something that we can actually distinguish and measure, comes from. And so then we have a scenario where deal flow is providing an income to drive accurate information to improve the quality and amount of deal flow. And that's where you get your stable market structure from.
Right. And I know that you kind of mentioned this before, but how would you study game theory quite a bit, and so how would this play in there?
Game theory was actually the approach that got me to here in the first place.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about this property of communication, and in particular, communicating consensuses. So if you're on the internet, everyone knows division's very easy to come by. Agreement is much more difficult to come by. So how could you design a protocol to get people or instruments or people and instruments or anything else to agree with each other communicating on the internet? And that's where game theory, there's an entire class of games where agreement is in the individual interests of the players in the game. And so by extending a situation where it's in your own personal interest to agree with the group, to having a computer program that's promulgating the group consensus in a way that allows people to, without disagreeing with the group, change what the group is agreeing to, creates a scenario where people can simultaneously negotiate and remain in lockstep with each other. And so the challenge for any given situation is coming up with a information structure that the group has an interest in converging towards. And in the case of markets, that structure isn't the price, it's the price over time.
Yes, it's kind of like a market equivalent of Ludwig Wittgenstein's language games, in a way.
I'm not sufficiently familiar with Wittgenstein's work to be sure about that. I've read some of his dialogues, and I'm familiar with his sort of games about systems. And for computer programmers, his quote, something along the lines of, "Yes, this is nonsense, but it's important nonsense," speaks very much to the experience of programming in languages.
He's very
But
quote-worthy.
yeah, but yeah, I view this as almost more blind luck than anything else. Um, I was working on this idea about communication, came up with this approach, applied it to markets to sort of see how well the approach worked, if it could even approximate existing markets. And it turns out that the mechanism that falls out of it works better on paper.
What would you say is the method for implementing a system like this? Would it be more of a grassroots type of thing from the bottom up, or would it be more top down, like a political method to put this into effect?
Sadly, I think there's a certain amount of top down that's necessary because operating a marketplace is ultimately a regulatory act. Markets can't really exist without contract. Contract can't exist without government compliance. And in the financial and market sectors, getting government compliance for being able to put contracts out in this fashion requires jumping through whatever the hoops that government has decided. So I'm in a position, I'm basically looking for people who would like to license the technology, go jump through those hoops, do the initial customer acquisition, and operate a marketplace that would use this price discovery method. It would be sort of nice if there were a decent path for disparate people to sort of roll out of bed and decide to start contributing towards something that could bubble up, but I don't know how that would work.
All right. Is there anything else that you would like to mention that I haven't brought up yet?
We really covered the highlights on this one. I mean, there's some other kind of intriguing aspects of where this goes in terms of regulatory compliance. It's basically impossible to launder money through these kinds of marketplaces because you can't target a counterparty. So that's kind of interesting. Just recently, and I mentioned this a little earlier, but I've started looking at the existing markets from a predator-prey standpoint and how the logistic maps intrinsic chaotic behavior essentially means that the markets have a uneliminable noise within them, whereas my system is built off a series of linear integral equations. So they basically function the same way the heat equations do, to cause noise to constantly flow out of the system as it seeks its low entropy point. But those might be discussions for another day.
Well, this has been fantastic. Thanks for coming on. Thank you. This has been Point Counterpoint. I'm your host, Chris Wright, with Noah Healy. Thank you.
Thanks for having me here, Chris.